And I got to tell you that what was running through my mind as came down to the wire, and the announcer said, and the winner is Lee, because we're both Lees. It was like a feeling of being like at the edge of a cliff. And I got to tell you that I was either going to jump off and soar, or I was going to fall to the bottom and crash. And it was the feeling of a free fall when Haney's name was called for first place.
But again, it was the size factor that Haney had. It was like, well, you can beat me on that, but take that, you know, and it went like that. And Labrada came very close to toppling Haney, you know, in Rimini in Italy and in 1990, which was the drug-tested contest. But it was not to be, you know, and again, Lee Labrada would have been a magnificent Mr. Olympia in personality and bearing.
I was very young as a bodybuilder, and I started seeing things happen to me. I started getting injuries and actually almost going into like a burnout, you know, with competing. Going into then the 1990 Mr. Olympia, ended up getting 5th place in that show, so I dropped another place, and I was like, oh my God, I'm done, you know, in bodybuilding.
You've got to feel sorry for Rich, because if Lee Haney had never existed, he'd have been at least a 3-time Mr. Olympia, because he was second 3 times in a row at a phenomenally, you know, most pros today, well, they're not turning pro until they're 30, and he was doing this at 22, 23, 24, you know, and, you know, he was another magnificent guy.
I talked to Shirley. I said, baby, you know, I've done 7 Olympias in a row. No one has ever done 7 in a row. And I said to her, well, what do you think about that being, you know, it? Being a competitor surely is. She looked at me and said, it? What do you mean, it? She said, you gotta do 8. What are you talking about? Let's don't even have this conversation anymore. That's my wife. And so that gave me enough zeal and fire to go on to do that 8th Olympia.
But along came a guy who was equal in size and poundage and had good shape. Everybody decries Dorian Yates' shape, but he's got the shape, he's got the proportions, you know, there's no long torso or short legs, or he's got the back and everything. And Lee Haney knew he was a threat.
And if you're looking to knock out a Titan, you got to have a guy, at least in my mind, you got to have another Titan.
And they went at it in Orlando in 91. The symmetry round, Lee Haney won. The muscularity round, Dorian won.
I don't know if it's the first time, I haven't seen it since, where there's just a 2-man pose down. It was Dorian Yates and Lee Haney, and I was the first guy to go on stage to have the stature and the body weight to stand next to Lee Haney. And I enjoyed being the underdog.
And the crowd was going nuts. These 2 big guys, nobody'd seen 245, 250-pound guys, 2 of them going at it in condition, you know. And it took 4.5 minutes, because I timed it, for them to do the then 7 compulsory poses, and they gave everything, you know.
You couldn't be beat. That was my mindset. That's what I worked on my entire career. And it all came together when I chose the music Excalibur. That was the return of the king.
In 1984, his first Mr. Olympia, he posed to the theme from Excalibur. And so the certain symmetry took place, because his last contest he posed to Excalibur again, gave this magnificent performance, and of course won the posing round.
So I went into that competition in perfect peace. At the end of the night, my arms was raised in victory.
And he took home the 8th Sandow, and that was the end of his competitive days. And Lee Haney, I think if you had to say who was the first gentleman of bodybuilding, who was the greatest ambassador we ever had and still have, it's Lee Haney.
A new age of self-awareness had hit the bodybuilding industry at the turn of the 1990s. Industry leaders sought a presence at the Olympic Games. The innocence of years gone by started to erode as athletes began submitting themselves to drug tests.
Well, I think the feeling was that there needed to be drug testing because, you know, there was a hope. Ben Weider wanted to get bodybuilding into the Olympics, so we had to sort of approach IOC standards in drug testing.
We all got notified that they were going to be instituting a drug test in, I believe, like October.
So that was introduced. for the first time at the 1990 Arnold Classic.
I won the Arnold Classic Championships, and a week later I wound up in Columbus, Ohio, and I won the competition with perfect scores. $60,000. Mike Ashley had gotten second place there. Mike Christian was third. And I went on a tour of Canada, and while I was there, I got a call from Wayne DeMilia a week later that my drug test had came back positive, and I have an opportunity to check sample B either in Westwood, Los Angeles, or in Chicago. However, I was on tour, and I couldn't do anything about it.
NBC filmed it. They had to re-edit it. They were showing it at a later date. Mike Ashley was the winner. Very clunky.
So my next call was obviously to Joe Weider, like, what do I do here? I mean, this is a time when they didn't have the internet. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have cell phones where you could text message stuff. So there's 4,000 people that were in Columbus, Ohio that wouldn't be notified of this information for nearly 3 months. And Joe Weider had just said, basically, Sean, stay on your game, do what you have to do. You're one of our, most highly decorated athletes. We are going to support you and prove them wrong in Chicago in 1990. So it was about 8 months I had between losing $60,000 and watching the Arnold Classic Championship go right through my hands to trying to get redemption in Chicago.
So the 1990 Mr. Olympia was going to be drug tested, so they decided to test all the guys before, so you'd know who'd failed on Friday, so we wouldn't have the embarrassment of taking the trophy off somebody.
Was I baffled by the test results? Of course I was. I didn't think I would test positive because, based on the athletes talking amongst each other, certain drugs work certain ways and they're faster acting and they're, in and out of your system. And of course, none of us knew how to pass a test. And that was never my goal either. But of course, I didn't argue it. I didn't try to fight it. I just went back to the gym. I went back to the gym, but I knew I had to work even harder because I had 8 months and I had a legend I was going up against in Chicago in the form of Lee Haney.
So Friday night, out came the results, and favourites like Momo Benaziz and Barry DeMay had failed, and Van Walcott Smith and Vince Commoff had failed. So two of the top names were out of the Olympia, Come the day of the contest, Saturday afternoon, all the guys that were left in walked out, and it was immediately obvious that all of them were down in size. Lee Haney, Sean, I've always told Sean this, the legs were still there, but the upper body just didn't have that density. There was three guys who looked the same as they always did. That was Mike Christian, Francis Benfato, and Frank Hillebrand. Everybody else was down a bit. Lee Labrada, Gaspari, all of them were down. But then another thing happened. Vince McMahon launched his World Bodybuilding Federation. He said he was going to just do a magazine, and he had a booth at the Olympia. But at the conclusion of this Olympia, his guys, Tom Platz and others, went round handing out, announcing the new federation, the WBF, the World Bodybuilding Federation.
When he was doing very well with professional wrestling and decided he would try his hand at bodybuilding,
it sent earthquakes through the whole bodybuilding landscape. Everybody thought McMahon, with all his money and everything, this is going to happen. And suddenly we knew who was in there, the likes of Stridham, DeMay, Quinn, Mike Chris, really big hitters that were top 6 finishes in the Olympia every time they were in it. Mike Quinn was there.
Vince McMahon had just entered into bodybuilding and was coming along with the WBF, a new federation, offering more money, and he secured 13 bodybuilders away from the IFBB, which made some things a little bit easier for some bodybuilders that were in the IFBB because he took a few good guys.
The amount of money they were offered was enormous. I think Barry was getting $300,000 a year. This is back in 1990. And even somebody like Lee Haney's contract with Weider would probably be 40 or 50 grand at that time, so it was enormous. But Barry said, and this goes back to what I said before, the drive is always to be the best in the world. He said, we all realised we weren't going to be the best in the world. We were going to be best in this little group. We weren't going to beat Lee Haney. And somehow the drive went out of it, and some of the guys were far from the best.
I think what knocked the legs out from Vince McMahon was the scandal he had with the steroids.
And I think he decided that, bodybuilding with its, the slur of drugs, it had been an experiment that he'd gone into with a good heart, but it was time to be strategic and, you know, concentrate on what he knew best. And that was the end of the WBF.
Had he had some good management, I mean, what makes you extremely professional, that formula that works so well in wrestling ain't going to work in bodybuilding. And he applied that same formula, and it didn't work. If he would have just listened to some people, he wouldn't have wasted money, and he could have made a big dent. It might have been different, but he was the one that forced Joe to start offering contracts, because then eventually he became afraid he would lose everybody.
He did call up the Ben and Joe Weider after it folded and said, you know, I'm done. You know, you guys know what you're doing more than I do in this sphere, and good luck and no hard feelings. So, you know, there was no rancor in the end there.
While the industry dealt with its various troubles, the competitive standard set by Lee Haney was about to be shattered by the new juggernaut of the 90s, Dorian Yates.
And then along came Dorian Yates from England, who won the Mr. Olympia 6 times and just brought a whole new standard of hardness and freakiness. And, you know, to me, the golden age of bodybuilding was the 90s, you know. I think after that, you know, Yates is often blamed for taking the sport in the wrong direction. But what he was doing what he knew he had to do to win. And hardness and mass seemed to be the criteria, the calling cards.
You know, so you had the more symmetrical and classical type physiques like Sean Ray, Lee Labrada. You had Barry DeMay. You know, you had a number of guys that were threatening that standard. Okay, but that was squelched. Again, we were at a crossroads, and the crossroads went the other way. Again, back to the past, to the large bodybuilder in the incarnation of Dorian Yates this time, and it has never looked back.
You know what? If I can get past Labrada, Haney doesn't have much longer to go. I could potentially become Mr. Olympia, and it became very real to me in 1990, getting third in that Olympia, that I would one day become Mr. Olympia, because there's no way Lee Haney can last that much longer. Unfortunately for me, I didn't see the shadow coming. Dorian Yates by way of England.
When I turned pro, I don't think I was seriously thinking about being Mr. Olympia. I just wanted to be a good pro, and that's as far as my thinking was going at that time. So I was the first European bodybuilder to win Mr. Olympia, and also training at the time in Europe.
Dorian Yates was able to dominate bodybuilding in the 90s because he was bigger and thicker than anybody else. Plus, he was aesthetic, as I say. He was Herculean, not Apollonian. So he didn't have a pretty, shapely physique, but it was balanced and artistic and sculptural.
The evolution of bodybuilding changed when Dorian came into the scene, because he was one of the first bodybuilders to compete at like 260, 265. So he set this like freakiness to the sport.
Well, in 1992, of course, Dorian Yates won his first Mr. Olympia in Helsinki, Finland.
Mr. Olympia was wide open that year. I'll never forget it. It was wide open in 1992. Ferrigno was coming back, and he was competing over 300 pounds.
Part of me said, what am I doing here? I'm standing here competing. Am I out of my mind? I'm 42 years old. These guys like Sean Ray, these guys like, Milo Savage and everything, they're like in their 20s. But then I realized that I got a lot of work to do, because after coming back for 17 years, you need a couple of years training under your belt. And I got a lot to learn, because the hardest thing for me was the posing. All you guys are standing there with the ab tense and relaxed. I was basically just standing like in the 70s, kind of like semi-relaxed. And people kept yelling, the audience, pose, tense. And it was very foreign to me, but I knew I had a lot of work to do.
To be honest, it was a little bit hard for me that year, because I didn't have any one person to focus on. I got to beat this guy. There was a whole bunch of guys that could have possibly won the title. So it was a little bit hard. And also it's a barrier to get over. Could it really be me? Could I be the best in the world at my chosen sport? There was that barrier, and then eventually I got over that. Like, why the hell not? It's got to be somebody, and I don't think anyone's training harder than me. And I always had that inside of me, like, I don't think anyone could have done any more. So that gives you a lot of strength.
They called me second, and it was a relief. It was a joyful moment. It was a celebration for me, because at that point I knew that I had obviously probably earned a spot to be there Never really questioned myself if I should be there or not, but I knew at that point I have a responsibility to do, and that was to move forward and to be better.
I went on to have to watch the big side phrases like gargantuan and mass monsters was being ushered in. Paul Dillette came onto the scene. Akam Albrecht was coming into the fray. Jean-Pierre Fuchs. All these big 6-foot bodybuilders were coming in, making a big impact on the industry. And this is where I think bodybuilding started to change.
93 was a great year where I made a leap forward in physique development and body weight on stage nobody had seen before. That was great.
Dorian Yates showed up in 93, a transformed bodybuilder that was unbeatable. Dorian was taking bodybuilding to a whole new level of impression. I mean, people were just getting overwhelmed with this size.
I was the first guy to compete at the Mr. Olympia, I think, in condition over 250 pounds. But I had this drive and I had this system of high-intensity, heavy training, which has gotten me from a backstreet basement gym in Birmingham in England to be Mr. Olympia. So it's, once your foot's on the pedal, on the gas, it's a little bit hard to take it off.
1994 came along and I got first runner-up in the Mr. Olympia Championships. My first time in that position, and this is when Dorian tore his bicep and came in a little bit heavy and bloated around the midsection.
I was very stubborn. I wanted to train as, all year round, just as heavy as I did in the off-season coming up for a contest, which was not the best idea. I think I was doing bent over rows with like 440 or something like that, 6 weeks out from the contest, and there was a bang and a sharp pain in my left bicep. So obviously it was a serious injury, there was damage there.
I think a lot of people, you could flip a coin on who you talk to and what they liked, had me winning that contest. Whereas Dorian felt in certain poses, he won enough poses to win the competition. I can't take that away from him because clearly he was bigger. Clearly he was more dominant, more imposing figure. I mean, he brought all that stuff.
97, he had a quad injury early on in the year and then another one. And then 3 weeks before the contest,
I had some advice, which probably now is not good advice. I had a cortisone injection in that tendon, which of course takes the inflammation away, but also weakens the tendon. And I did ease up a little bit on the training. And 3 weeks out, I was doing a tricep exercise, not particularly heavy, and bang. There was a really intense, sharp pain and a noise, and I knew it was a serious injury.
I was out in the garden, the phone rang. It's 6 o'clock in Santa Monica, it's 2 o'clock in England. And my wife Anne says, Dorian's on the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, this isn't good.
Again, it was difficult, and psychologically it's very hard going into a contest when you're not going in all guns blazing. But I managed to pull off that win.
He still wanted to get it repaired and come back the next year, but in the end he got it repaired, it never came back, he couldn't handle the weights.
I couldn't train 100%, so that for me, that was a message. You want to compete the best in the world, you can't do that unless you're training 100%. So that was a time for me to retire. It wasn't something that I prepared for or considered. It was something that was more or less forced upon me, but maybe it's a good thing.
And he pushed his body to the point where he tore it apart over several years. At the end of his career, it had all kinds of damage to his body because you cannot push yourself that hard and not have the body give way. But in the meantime, he was able to get a level of development and a thickness and a hardness that the other guys couldn't get.
And, that was his reign over. He'd won 6.
I got to say the 90s is probably the most competitive period in bodybuilding as far as the depth of quality of physique and talent that were there. You got 6 or 7 guys there that are very, very close competitively that could interchange at any point depending on what condition the guys came in. So I would say definitely that was the most intense period. So whether I won 3, 4, 5, 6 Mr. Olympias, it would still be a great achievement with the people I were competing against.
When Yates gracefully retired in 1997, the torch was passed to another born champion who changed bodybuilding for good, Ronnie Coleman.
Today I go to the gym, and Brian Dobson is the owner. He's like, man, he sees me come in. He's like, man, you compete? I'm like, no. He said, you ever competed? I'm like, no. Like, you're pretty big. You probably need to compete. You could probably be world champion one day. And as soon as he said that, first thing out of my mouth was, no thank you. Now, I'm not into bodybuilding. I haven't even picked up a bodybuilding magazine. I don't know nothing about what's going on in that sport. I'm very unconcerned. It's just like something foreign to me. No, you been asking me that every day I come in, every day I come in here, and every day I tell you no, so I'm still gonna have to, decline the offer. He's like, man, I'm telling you, you need to do this. He's like, I tell you what, he said, there's a contest coming up in about 3-4 months. He's like, if you compete in this show, I give you a free membership to the gym. And remember, I'm struggling, so anytime somebody offers you something free at a time like that, you're like, okay, what I got to do?
Nobody's had a slower climb up the ladder, Made his pro debut in '92 at the Olympia, didn't finish in the top 15, was a journeyman pro, in and out, in and out.
And I can remember it like it was yesterday, because I remember I was backstage pumping up, and I look over, and then Sean Ray's over there. He's doing push-ups on the wall, and the first thing I see is this big old chest sticking out while all these striations and stuff are going. I'm like, man, I'm in the wrong sport. I placed dead last in that show.
98 became his breakthrough year in a big way. At the end of 97, there were 7 Grand Prix in Europe, and Kevin Levrone won the first 6. And then, sensationally, Ronnie beat Kevin. Kevin was a fantastic bodybuilder. He won that last one, and that was a sign, because then in 98 he won the San Francisco show, or him and Levrone went in 3 shows in May, New York, San Francisco, and in Canada, Montreal or something. And Ronnie won 2, Levrone won 1.
4 or 5 months after that, in September, and I was faced with, at that point, the Olympia was wide open.
And Flex was the favorite. But even then, you could see Flex's back double biceps is a thing of beauty. But the only guy in that lineup of that time, Levrone, Sean, Nasser, that could match him on double biceps, not beat him, but not be vanquished by him, was Ronnie.
So we come down to Mr. Olympia. I'm like, man, if I can make the top 3, this will be better than a dream come true, because I know I never win, because like I said, I just got in the sport just to keep my free membership to the gym.
The Olympia was what I wanted in 1998 because Dorian Yates had retired. He'd gotten injured. I'd sat behind him for 6 years. I'd watched the tail end of the Lee Haney era. And lo and behold, me, Kevin, and Flex see Ronnie Coleman, a guy that we used to not even pay attention to, leapfrog over all of us.
So come the day of the show in New York, 1998, Mr. Olympia, Madison Square Garden, great crowd. They walk out. And Ronnie is ripped to shreds. He's as hard. He's maybe a bit down in fullness, but he's as hard as a rock. In fact, he looked almost grey to me, and at one point I thought, he's going to pass out. He was right on the edge. Flex was just a little bit off. Still, Flex took the prejudging, but Ronnie came back in the evening and took the title.
They leading up to the show, everybody already gave it to Flex, so I'm like, okay, at least I got a second, so I'm still just as happy as I can ever be. So all of a sudden, Wayne calls out Flex Wheeler name for second. I'm like, did I just hear that right? And I'm like, yeah. And the first thing I did was collapse.
Ronnie became from this quiet, slow burn guy in the background who nobody ever thought of being a threat to anything. He loved being Mr. Olympia. And 1999, he came back, maybe not as hard as 98, but fuller. And he was like a walking anatomy chart, And he just dominated on size. He just got bigger and bigger.
My heavy was 04 when I was 296 on the Olympia stage.
I saw the writing on the wall with Ronnie Coleman coming in at 280, 275, 290 pounds, that bodybuilding and the landscape was forever changed.
The size just blew everybody away, Jay Cutler was in it, but there was no contest that time. Ronnie was just an amalgam of muscle that, a freak of nature that, we won't see for a long time.
Ronnie Coleman reigned supreme until 2005, tying Lee Haney's 8 Mr. Olympia wins. Coleman even won 4 Mr. Olympia contests over the man who would, in time, come to eclipse him, Jay Cutler.
I always wanted to be somebody. I picked up a magazine when I was 12 years old. I saw a picture of Chris Dickerson, and my sister's boyfriend, he had some old magazines laying around, and I was just overwhelmed by what the body could look like. I couldn't believe it. You know, I had seen superheroes before, you know, in Batman and Superman in cartoons, but I never saw in real life a physique look like that. And I just, you know, I marveled at it. I just couldn't believe that this was actually attainable. So here I am from small town USA. My dream is to always go to California and train amongst, you know, the pros I read about in the magazines, but it can be possible because these other guys did it.
In 2001, Jay Cutler nearly beat Ronnie, but after that, Ronnie, you know, reeled off another few victories.
I knew then that I had something that I could battle Ronnie with, and that was really what drove me into 2001, where I was a much better athlete coming into Mr. Olympia. I took the whole year to prepare. Now I have the fans behind me because now I was an underdog, and I was happy. I was ecstatic to be second place. That was almost as great as winning to me because I was really competitive, and a lot of people thought Jay should win this competition.
So Jay was always finishing second, apart from 2002 when he didn't compete in the Olympia. In 2005, it was very, very close. Personally, I would have given it to Jay, and Jay was absolutely devastated by it.
So I felt in 2005, I matched Ronnie Coleman like in a lot of poses, including some back shots, which I never thought I did. I improved a little bit there, and he still was definitely at a different level.
But in 2006, he finally beat Ronnie.
When we were building up for the competition, you know, of course, became a Ronnie and Jay show after all these years after being second, you know, 4 times in a row. Of course, it's, you know, it was almost like Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, Mr. Olympia. So when I won and knocked off the champ, which he was going for his record 9th, Mr. Olympia, he had already won 8. It was a huge monkey off my back.
And of course, after that, Jay won in 2007, and some people thought Martinez had won, and then Jay lost in 2008 to Dexter, and it seemed that Jay it was over for Jay.
Going back and looking at Jay from the previous years, you know, each year he was getting, you know, he wasn't getting much better than he was the previous year, so he was getting worse and worse. I said, well, you know, I think I can beat Jay. You know, so my trainer at the time, Joe McNeil, and I, we put our heads together, came up with a game plan, man, and we went into the Olympia, you know, full steam ahead. I just knew I could beat him that show. I knew he wasn't going to be on because he's trying to play, you know, after me winning the Arnold and all that stuff, it was the battle between me and Jay. So I knew he was going to try and play my game. So that's how I beat him in the GNC show of strength, because he tried to play my game and tried to get shredded and come down, and he lost a lot of weight and tried to get just as hard as me. And that's how I was able to beat him there. Well, I knew he was going to do the same thing for the Arnold Olympia in 2008, which he did. And I was able to pull it off.
And Dexter did win it deservedly. Dexter, you know, was shredded, had great shape and fullness, had got all the body parts, you know. Jay was a bit off, so it was Dexter's year, and he won deservedly.
But when I won Mr. Olympia, I can't really put in words how I was feeling, because it took me 6 months to even acknowledge that I'm Mr. Olympia now. I mean, that really took me that long. You know, people will come up to me and they would be like, how are you, Mr. Olympia? It's like, man, I'm Dexter, you know what I'm saying? So it took forever for me to accept that name and that title. So to actually win and be on stage and just everything came out, all the dreams and everything that you can imagine that you went through in life, you know, all the sleeping on the floors and all that stuff I put my family through, all that stuff came out on stage that day, man, to win that title. So it was like, I won this title. That's what I sacrificed, you know, to get here.
And then he reinvented himself in 2009. When he walked out, it was like, wow.
I can't really fear any of that, and I can't fear losing because I've already lost the title and won it back, and I was the first guy to do that. And, you know, I'm only thinking victory.
And he just rewrote the record books with that type of physique, and then took it again in 2010.
Never really been a goal to be that all-time winner. I never thought 1 was attainable. Now I got 2, 3, 4.
Jay, I have tremendous respect for Jay, you know, on so many levels. He's like a great bodybuilder. I don't think I've shot anyone that wide as Jay. I mean, he was a true freak of his time.
This is what established, Jay Cutler. This is who I am. And I fell in love with this iron game for so many years ago when I mentioned I was 12 years old. And now look what I've achieved. I've become the best in the world or something. That's everyone's dream.
With the transition into another decade, one massive king gives way to another. One whose talents have a decidedly gifted future for bodybuilding.
Although I didn't have as many struggles in the amateur ranks, I definitely felt that, I had to learn quite a bit being a professional, because I wasn't being embraced by all the other guys, because they're saying, well, who this punk kid? He only competed for 2 years and he's pro and he's on the magazines, he's got sponsorships. It just taught me that the only way I was going to earn the respect and the love was to compete at a high level, and that's just what I did, and I made sure of that. I was very confident because I just knew in my heart that I'm going to shock the world. I just remember Jay shaking my hand and just saying, "You're the king now." And when he said that, I just realized, you know what? He's right. If I believe in it, he's right. If I don't believe in it, anything can happen. I could lose this thing next year. I truly feel that my type of physique is gonna recharge the sport a little bit. I think my physique is still growing at the age of 31. So who knows how big I may get, but at the same time, I'm not stupid. I know what got me the Mr. Olympia title. It wasn't trying to outmass anyone. It was about being more aesthetic, but yet having the muscles round, like very cartoonish, and having sharp conditioning to make those muscles stand out even larger than life.
I think after we watched Phil Heath win this Mr. Olympia in 2001, one thing is sure, bodybuilding is alive and well.
I look at Phil and I think about myself. I think about Sean Ray. I think about Flex Wheeler. I think about size with class, mass. Sean used to say that all the time. I think about Lee Labrada. I think about Gaspare, the cuts. Everything. He ties it all in together. I think today, where we are right now, he's certainly a good champion for the sport.
Phil brings a different type of flavor, one that sort of takes a little step back from the monstrous physique to more balanced size and symmetry, which that's where I'm from, so that's what I like.
And I'm happy Phil Heath won, because to me, he has a beautiful body. It's aesthetic. And I hate to see the sport get to a point that we're sacrificing symmetry.
In the course of just over a century, what was once a sideshow attraction had developed into a new way of life for millions around the world. Men who brought discipline, scientific expertise, and unrelenting dedication have inspired each successive generation to studiously build upon their achievements. Bodybuilding as a sport has as much to offer its competitors in return as they are willing to dedicate of themselves. Like the training regimes, business practices, and the athletes, bodybuilding will always be changing. It will never cease to evolve.
A lot of sports have evolved. We use the term evolution here. What I described before, going from Eugene Sandow to Yates and guys who came after, that was evolution. But evolution usually means, a process of improvement. And I'm not sure, in many ways, I think the evolution of bodybuilding has peaked with the 90s, and we're not going forward with creating the perfect human specimen.
I think the guys now are generally bigger, but the conditioning is not as keen as it was in the 90s. So yes, the bodybuilders are bigger. Are they better? Not necessarily, I don't think.
You're talking about 18 almost consecutive wins, almost 2 decades of champions, Olympian champions that were freaks, and it seemed that the fans liked the freaks. They liked the, even to this very day, the freaks sell. Dorian sells, Ronnie sells, Jay sells. So over that 20-year period, could it have been different? Possibly. Just think, Sean, if you won Mr. Olympia, or Kevin won Mr. Olympia, or Flex won Mr. Olympia, how things may have changed the tide.
It's more of a freak factor nowadays. And I think the whole society is changing towards that. How photography is today, if you look at any bodybuilding magazine, and it's a natural evolution with how the physiques looks today. It's all about shooting big weights, huge muscles, using like wide angles used to enhance it. So I shoot differently. Before I could use like a telephoto lens, to shoot everything, because it makes everything in proportion, like the eye sees it, or a little bit more compressed maybe. And now we use a lot of wide angle lenses used to make an arm look super big, because that's what the latest fashion is somehow.
The youngsters that are getting into this sport look at the magazines, they look at the bodybuilders that are at the top now, and they realize that to get there, they're going to have to do things that they don't want to do.
I look at where it is now, it is a little bit different from my eyes. Golly, man, I like a 63 Chevy. I got a 74 Corvette. I think I'm cool. But, things change.
I hear all the time people complaining that the bodybuilders are too big. And I don't think they're too big at all. I think they're just heavyweights or super heavyweights. The problem is that the smaller bodybuilders just don't get enough recognition because there aren't weight divisions in the pros. There are in the amateurs. Bodybuilding is not supposed to be about mass. It is supposed to be about sculptural perfection. And if you have a guy who's 5'9", 225 pounds, absolutely perfect, he shouldn't be standing next to somebody who's 295 pounds, any more than the middleweight boxer should be forced to fight the heavyweight boxer. Weight divisions restore the aesthetic quality to bodybuilding.
It's hard to say if we're heading in the right direction. It's just the evolution. It's going to get there anyway.
I think the evolution of bodybuilding is along several lines. I think it's evolution in some sense, like nutritional supplements and awareness and what's available and what's known about it now. The science of longevity, that as well. Equipment design and the quality of equipment, and just what's known about training methods and all the stuff. There's more tools available now than ever before.
I think that pro bodybuilding is going to come back to a state where the physiques are more attractive from a classical sense. I think that we're going to come full circle.
I always feel that bodybuilding is going to be there. I'm not sure if bodybuilders are going to get to the 300-pound mark. They probably will. And they're probably going to have bigger prize monies, but it's still going to be kind of like this different type of cultish kind of sport. But I still think it's always going to be there for the future.
I just loved what was happening. I felt proud that I was doing something worthwhile, but I couldn't afford to make a single mistake.
Where we are here today in the evolution, I think it's bodybuilding is positioned right now the strongest that it's ever been in the history.
Just as bodybuilding has evolved and as most things evolve, starting with the core, and then having a broader group of people become interested in that, but maybe not aspire to that exact same level of intensity. And so it tends to naturally evolve. And that's what I think you see in the Olympia. I think it's a very healthy evolution. The more people that can participate as participants and as spectators, the better. And I think that's what you see with the Olympia right now.
Even though bodybuilding has evolved with certain, physique changes and a lot more money is around than it was before, Arnold and those guys, Larry Scott, it didn't justify a living for them. Today, you guys can have a career out of it.
Prize money has grown by leaps and bounds since those early years. I mean, for example, in 1970, Arnold Schwarzenegger won. The total purse was $1,000. Today, we have $815,000 as a total purse, which includes men's bodybuilding, women's bodybuilding, fitness, figure, and now bikini, with $200,000 being the grand prize for that the overall men's winner. So I mean, just when you look at prize money alone, it's an enormous increase. I mean, and what that means is that people are able to make a living and earn a living as professional bodybuilders. They don't need to have part-time jobs. They don't need to have full-time jobs.
Bodybuilding in the early years, the athletes were required to work jobs because they didn't have the support of the sponsors, and the prize money wasn't so valued. There wasn't so many bodybuilding competitions. Nowadays, we have so many bodybuilding competitions where the athletes can compete. They can qualify for the Mr. Olympia. They can be contracted by companies because the exposure is much more of an advantage, having not only magazines themselves, but the internet has become so huge in the marketing perspective.
It has evolved into something so awesome that I don't know where it's going, but it can only go up exponentially because of technology. I mean, now we're having video conferencing through businesses. Well, don't you think that at some point in time, a bodybuilder like myself may take one of my phones and use a Wi-Fi network and say, hey, this is what I'm looking like right now. Give me some tips on my posing or something like that. While I'm in Mumbai, India, of all places, freaking third world country, getting ready to compete, where my trainer can actually stay home and give me direction online.
Because of the internet now, and back then there was no internet. There were no cell phones. So if you won the Olympia, you'd have to wait for the magazine to come out, or you'd call Venice to find out who won the Olympia. Well, now because of the internet, you see that faster. So I think because of that internet access now, you can train anywhere.
The advancements of technology now, you're going to see the Mr. Olympia that Joe Weider created on the television. You're going to be able to get it on every mobile device that's made now. As a matter of fact, we're already making it possible to see it on your iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, things like this. But the real connection of what people want to do is watch it on the television. So I think at least in the next 2 years, you're going to see a TV quality production on your television that the internet is going to make possible.
I think we need to do is we need to get the younger demographics involved in bodybuilding. You know, the young kids today are in video games and extreme sports and that kind of thing. You know, we need to get these young kids and these young athletes involved in the sport. We need to get them at a young age. Okay, that's how we're going to really grow the participation component, you know, of the sport. Okay, so you know, I think that is going to be the most deciding factor. I think that's going to be a challenge, but I think that's what we need to do. We need to get these young kids interested in bodybuilding.
I think you're going to see a comeback of younger people getting back into it, saying this is pretty great. Maybe on a healthier way to do it, you're going to see that still, that bodybuilding era, maybe come back. Everything comes back in cycles. I think you're going to see that come back eventually.
One thing we're not going to see happen is Joe's vision of bodybuilding dying off anytime soon. I think we're headed in the right direction, and you know, with people like Jim Mannion at the helm, Rafael Santoja, we are in very good company, in very good shape in terms of where we're going. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years. I'm going to just sit back and enjoy the ride.
The big prediction I made in the late 50s and early 60s, how bodybuilding would change the whole world. And it did.